Hi, my name is Duncan Pritchard. I'm a Chancellor's Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. And I work mainly in a field of philosophy known as epistemology, which is also called the theory of knowledge. And that's effectively what this MOOC is about. It's about the problem of skepticism, where skepticism in turn is about doubt about whether we know the things that we take ourselves to know. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this course. In particular, we're going to be distinguishing between a moderate form of skepticism, which is a healthy thing, it's the kind of thing that's an antidote to gullibility, and a radical form of skepticism, which is much more disturbing. And we'll be considering the arguments that could be offered for each. In terms of the moderate skepticism, we'll be locating that view within an Aristotelian account of the good life, the virtuous life, and trying to explain how a virtuous life might involve a moderate skepticism of that kind. And then in terms of radical skepticism, we'll be exploring what might motivate this puzzle, this radical skeptical puzzle about whether knowledge is impossible. And we'll be looking at some responses that have been offered to that puzzle. Hope you enjoy the course. In this module, we're going to be exploring some foundational questions about the nature of skepticism. We begin with an important distinction between a healthy skepticism, the antidote to gullibility, and a skepticism that comes in a more radical guise. We'll consider how the latter can lead to relativism about truth, the idea that there is no objective truth but only subjective viewpoints. As we will see, such relativism has a dubious intellectual pedigree, and it can also have some pernicious social consequences. Finally, since skepticism purports to show that we know much less than we think we know, we will reflect on the nature of knowledge. Skepticism is about doubt. We often adopt a skeptical attitude, and rightly so, as a certain degree of skepticism is usually a good thing. Skepticism in this sense is the antidote to gullibility, and surely no one wants to be gullible. But a healthy, moderate skepticism can also easily drift into something more extreme, radical skepticism. Consider, for example, the skepticism that one finds in certain quarters about the reliability of scientific expertise, such as regarding the scientific consensus on man-made climate change. Notice how this kind of skepticism is very different from being skeptical about, say, what a used car salesman is telling you. In the latter case, your doubt is local, in that it is specific to this particular scenario. But when one is doubtful about scientific expertise in general, then one's doubt is no longer local in this sense. If even the scientific experts are not to be trusted, then on what can we rely? A radical skeptical doubt is thus in danger of calling everything that one believes into question. Once radical skepticism takes root in our public life, then it also has all kinds of practical ramifications, many of them not particularly appealing. One consequence is a lack of concern for accuracy and the truth. Think, for example, of such contemporary phenomena as false facts and post-truth politics, whereby people in public life utter manifest falsehoods, seemingly with impunity. A radical skepticism effectively licenses such phenomena, since once everything is open to doubt, then there is nothing that is accepted as true. And hence, what's true starts to drop out of the equation altogether. This is why a radical skeptical doubt often gives way to prevailing relativism about truth, whereby the truth is just simply whatever someone says it is. So one camp endorses the scientific consensus about man-made climate change, whereas another camp argues that these scientists are all part of a global conspiracy to deceive the public. According to relativism, both camps can be right, since truth is just relative to one's subjective opinion. It might initially seem liberating to shake off a concern for truth and accuracy in this way, and to allow that opposing groups can both be right. But this is an illusion. This is because saying that the opposing camps are both right is as empty as saying that they are both wrong. Once you abandon the idea of accuracy, then it doesn't matter anymore what's true and what isn't. But getting things right should matter to us. That radical skepticism has pernicious consequences, such as leading to relativism, does not in itself demonstrate there's anything illegitimate about it. So what grounds are there for resisting the transition from a healthy, moderate skepticism to a problematic, radical skepticism? Okay, thanks very much for joining. I'm delighted to have you here. I'd like to begin the discussion by talking a little bit about this idea of moderate skepticism as driving scientific inquiry, as opposed to the idea of radical skepticism and relativism as being presenting challenges to scientific inquiry. And since we have two scientists here, I'd like to throw discussion open. Maybe Dave, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah. So I think moderate skepticism is at the root of science. So subjecting yourself to peer review, for example, and getting skeptical comments from your colleagues who are anonymous and can provide them sort of unabashed to you. So it's kind of the core principle by which science works. Interestingly, it has fallibility. So there's skepticism about the scientific method right now in terms of there's increasing attention to whether studies are reproducible, for example. Mm-hmm. And people are now generating a new scientific field of, can I reproduce these results? And one recent study did 100 psychology experiments again and found they could only reproduce about 40% of them. So that's an example of how science, I think it's sort of a moderate level of skepticism progressing and saying, how can we improve now on our past methods, which have some faults to them? It's interesting that to see the response of the research community. NIH has now published new guidelines for grants, and journals have new guidelines for reporting. But you can see certain elements of the community even sort of verging towards then the sort of more radical skepticism, where if we can't reproduce science, then is science, what's the value of science? And so even in high-level journals, for example, Nature, here's a commentary that said that copious peer-reviewed support can be found for whatever position one wants to take, a condition that justifies calls for still more research. Right. So you see this kind of cynicism that science can't produce. So it's a tension, I think, that we all live with as scientists, to sort of promote and be optimistic and try to make discoveries, and yet that's in tension with sort of being self-doubting at the same time. Yeah,
that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people think of science as being sort of the better conviction, right? It's not it's dogmatic even, right. And yet here we have an example of science actually generating its own skepticism about itself.
That's right.
So it's self-reflective in that way.
Yeah.
How does science prevent itself from slipping into radical skepticism, though, if there are these large-scale challenges to it?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the places that really helps is understanding the scale of the science you're doing. So if I start with physics, where there's a few areas where I think we really have convictions that are quite solid and reproducible over centuries now. And that helps to let you know that you can get things right. And I have to go, because we're all from UCI, with the UCI example of discovering the neutrino. Experimentally, people started to see what they thought were violations of conservation of energy and momentum, a bedrock principle of physics. And instead of throwing out that principle, you actually had people proposing, well, there must just be a particle we can't detect yet. Which sounds really bizarre to propose, but when you have something that's survived the test of time for so long, the right choice, I think, is to keep some confidence in that until you've really exhausted all options. And eventually, Rhinus did discover the neutrino and got the Nobel Prize for it, and a building named after him at UCI. Right? So, understanding, when you then move to psychology, which we haven't had the same length of time, the same quantitative tools, the problems are much more complex, you would expect to see reproducibility to be a bit more challenging. And as experiments get more expensive, there's that challenge in the scientific community of how do we take the time to reproduce things the way the system really wants it to do, so we can have that confidence in the results. So I think the skepticism is not about the underlying method, which has proven itself over time. It's about, are we really effectively applying it in a new set of spaces where the systems are more complex, the experiments are more expensive, and it's really hard to do the type of experiments over and over that we've done in simpler, less expensive areas of physics.
I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting is this idea of science is, over time, claims can get more and more well-grounded, more and more well-embedded, but they're always, in principle, open to challenge.
Yes.
You know, that's kind of built into the very idea of a scientific claim, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's the hardest thing for the general public to understand, is that weird dichotomy that scientists keep. I know this is right and true, but if it ever is proven wrong, I'll change my mind. Yeah. Right? That's just like an odd tension to hold as you're doing your research. My advisor, the best advice he ever gave me is, when you finally get the answer you think you should get is the time you should look most carefully at your experiment to see what you did wrong.
To follow up on it too, I think when you get sort of dogmas, it becomes a challenge to other scientists. So, especially if the dogmas are skeptical. For example, in my field, there was a dogma that neuroplasticity is very limited in adults and then adults with neural injury. And this almost became a target. So the radical sort of skeptic hypothesis about neuroplasticity became almost a target for other scientists and on a call to see if you could defeat it, right? And so there's this kind of weird dynamic where even more as scientists get more dogmatic or radical, then it stirs up other scientists to say, well, wait a second, I think that you're not telling the full story.
Well, there are two real challenges, frames of mind that can challenge scientific inquiry. One is radical skepticism, because what is the point if nothing is knowable, if you can never figure out grounded reasons for belief? But science grew out of actually in opposition to dogmatism, theocracy, and the like. And so certitude, which is almost the opposite of radical skepticism, is a kind of twin assault on what we view as the kind of grounded rationality we associate with science. You know, when the Royal Society was first created in the 17th century, their Latin motto was nullius in verba, which more or less translates into nothing because you say so, or not because you say so. And the whole idea was just because people in authority say, for example, that the sun goes around the earth, you know, I'm not going to take that for granted. So science itself is rooted in a skepticism about unanchored claims of certitude and belief, but it's also committed to not taking anyone's word for it. And I think that's the sort of healthy tension that allows the practice to continue to unfold.
I mean, the birth of the Royal Society is this fascinating historical episode, isn't it? Because we need a way of sort of having this imprimatur of who is the expert, who can we trust? You know, there's this new science is emerging. Suddenly now there's a proliferation of people who are representing themselves as experts, as opposed to a previous order where there was, you know, the theocratic truth which we could all sort of accept. And so now we need a way of accrediting them, and the Royal Society is one way of doing that. And of course now we do it in part through academies and through peer-reviewed journals and things like that.
Well, I think that's the other challenge for the public in looking at science is, unfortunately, as the issues we have addressed have become more and more complex and harder to understand, we run the risk of becoming the authorities telling people to just believe it. And without that real ability to engage them in the reason, the rational grounding as to why we are putting this position forward.
And I think in physics it's particularly challenging because it's so complex and mathematical. To explain it to a layperson is very, very difficult. So that sort of mediation is inherent to it. It seems like because the average person can't learn the math needed to understand the result.
And that's why I think science communication is so important, and many campuses have, you know, training for scientists, but also for non-scientists to figure out how to communicate scientific findings in a way that doesn't reduce their complexity or overstate their claims, but make scientific literacy something tangible for the public. And of course we do this with our GE requirements as well, and we expect students to have a certain understanding of science, but also of philosophy and of writing and of different forms of reasoning, because our citizenry needs these in order to make good decisions about the future of our planet.
Skepticism is concerned with doubt about what is true. Relativism, on the other hand, is the idea that what is true is relative to one's subjective opinion rather than being objective. So if your opinion is in conflict with someone else's opinion, then you can both be right. The way skepticism and relativism are related is that if one's skepticism is extensive enough, then it can start to feel as if one has no grip on what is objectively true. And hence, one might be tempted to jettison an objective notion of truth altogether. In this way, radical skepticism can lead to relativism. The fundamental problem with relativism is that if everyone is right, then everyone is just as much wrong too. The point is that if the idea of truth capturing whether a viewpoint is accurate is lost, then it really doesn't matter anymore whether that viewpoint is true or false. And yet we clearly do care about getting things right, particularly when this concerns something of personal importance. If, for example, you're trying to decide whether to have that risky operation, then you want to be apprised of the facts. But if relativism about truth is such a bad idea, then why are so many people attracted to it? One reason might be that some things are simply a matter of subjective opinion. What foods you like, what you find funny, your favourite film, and so on. But that some things, matters of taste essentially, are just a matter of subjective opinion doesn't mean that everything is. If a scientist claims to have discovered a new planet, for example, then there is nothing subjective about that. Either what they say is true, in which case the planet they describe exists, or it's false. Another rationale for relativism might be that it can seem to be liberating, and even a way of respecting the views of those we don't agree with. Rather than having to take sides in a debate, one can now just say that both parties are right. Isn't that a way of respecting the views of everyone concerned? But this isn't to respect the other person's views at all. After all, they weren't saying that this was their subjective opinion, but that it was true, that they were right and that you were wrong. Going relativist doesn't capture that at all. Or perhaps people are attracted to relativism because of the inherent fallibility of our judgments. Even our best judgments are, admittedly, sometimes mistaken. Even the best scientific theories of the day, for example, could eventually give way to better scientific theories. But how confident can we be then that we're ever objectively right? Accordingly, why not jettison the idea of truth as objective and instead treat it as merely relative? That we are fallible creatures is not a good reason to endorse relativism, however, since by itself all it means is that our attempts to get an objective truth sometimes misfire. Could it instead be a good reason for skepticism about whether our beliefs are objectively true? But why should the fact that I'm sometimes mistaken be a standing reason to think that I'm mistaken right now? That I'm sometimes mistaken is obviously not a reason to think that I'm always mistaken. So fallibility by itself is not a good basis for either relativism or skepticism. I mean, this is a key issue here because, there may be sectors of the public who are quite happy with the idea of science as being objective, but they nonetheless are very skeptical about other kinds of claims it might make. I mean, as soon as you move away from science, anything in the sort of public domain, there's this perception that that's up for grabs. I think sometimes this goes hand in hand with the idea that everyone has a right to their opinion. Yeah. And therefore, all opinions are right. There's a kind of slippage there.
Yeah.
Right.
And this one thing we discuss in this MOOC, some of the troubling implications of that idea, because this is skepticism now trickling into relativism, and relativism about truth is the idea that what's true is just what one takes it to be, and how problematic that can be, especially when we think about public life and the sort of decisions that we need to make as a democratic society.
Well, I also think science is one place that is always struggling with, what you mentioned earlier about skepticism. We can be wrong, right? We have a method we believe in. The method doesn't always give us the right answer immediately for lots of reasons. You do your experiments. It's maybe a very complex system. It's maybe particularly in the area of medical and health, right? Because medical and health is probably one of the hardest places to do true experiments. And so you get these pronouncements. I mean, people feel ethically bound if they think they've found out something that's going to drastically impact your health. They need to share it. And determining when you're confident enough in your result to share it, you always have a chance of being wrong. And that's why, 10 years later, new studies are done. Maybe people live older or our environment changes. There's all sorts of reasons that the advice that was given 10, 15 years ago is not the right advice anymore. Yeah. And people see that as science being unreliable and relative. They just see the fallibility, not the rational grounding. And I think that's one of the challenges. When you understand skepticism allows for fallibility, but really wants a good method of doing things, you can understand why medicine will evolve and go through different stages of pronouncements. It has to.
I mean, one thing that's really problematic here is that science is quite upfront about its fallibility.
Yes.
When results are published, they say, here's the confidence interval and so forth that goes along with these results. And yet when they're reported, they're not reported that way. They're reported as facts.
Yeah.
As if they're just established things that one can bank. And then, of course, when there are further changes, it looks as if science has failed, which isn't, of course, what's actually occurring. Yeah. So there's a public perception, I think, as you say, of science there, partly due to how it's being reported.
Now, science is a bit of a model. It's a starting point for the conversation. Mm-hmm. But the importance of skepticism in our own lived experience, what orientation do we have to the world, it can't be that we're holding up science as the exemplar in the sense that the only way to be a properly, rationally skeptical person is to become a scientist. What science, I think, allows us to see is there is some value to searching for whether there's a reason to believe one thing as opposed to another, right? And at a very high, complicated level, if you're understanding the makeup of the solar system or the way the human body works, there are clear experiments. But there's a lot of questions about which we think it matters, whether there's a reason to believe one thing or another. I mean, what opinion should you have about the position of Shakespeare in the canon? You know, and it's not the same kind of discovery if someone claimed that they found a new planet, you know, and there is either a new planet or there's not. But for a lot of things that we believe or choose not to believe, the aspiration to try to position yourself so that you're always trying to have good reasons, right? And over time, those good reasons can change. It could be about literature or art or culture. It could be about the direction of the country, how you reflect on historical experience. And so science in that respect is one way of thinking about good reasons. But there's a lot of different kinds of good reasons that you could generate. And, you know, one of the principles of a free society, one of the maybe inspirational moments that people who were inspired by the Enlightenment can take is that for a long time humanity was told, we will tell you what to believe. We're the authority. Your job is not to come to belief on your own. Your job is to defer to structures of authority. Modern political conceptions of liberty assume that one of the potential glories of a free human being is that they can figure those things out for themselves. They don't have to defer to authority on a range of subjects. And so science can give us a bit of an inspiration, but when you're choosing what it means to understand what role skepticism or not should play in your life, I think you're choosing under what circumstances should my convictions reflect my effort at having some grounding in believing some things rather than others.
I mean, I think that's absolutely crucial because you think, we talked about literature, but as a human being, there's all kinds of decisions one needs to make. Dogmatism closes you off to lots of options, which, you know, just for example, you know, trying to work out in your personal relationships, you know, what judgments to make. These are things that are going to matter a great deal to you, and being right in your judgments is going to have huge consequences. But as you say, beyond science, just that in terms of living a good life, what constitutes living a good life will often involve being able to embody a sort of non-dogmatic stance in the way one relates to the world around one, you know, to proportion one's belief to one's evidence, to take a sort of Enlightenment ideal.
And the process by which one comes to one's values and convictions.
Right.
And so that, you know, that we might come to believe that God exists, we might come to believe that certain bodies of literature have a value that extends beyond our own personal experience and should be shared with others.
Right.
But we want to come to those commitments through a process of conversation, deliberation, listening, and considering different viewpoints on those issues, and seeing those as beliefs that we inhabit in a kind of a living and changeable manner. And so I liked a lot of the things that you wrote about in the book on skepticism, about it not just having beliefs that are true, but beliefs that have been arrived at through a process. And I think that's where education, both formal education in the university, but also education through reading, through engaging with intelligent journalism, which itself has standards that are not unlike scientific standards in terms of fact-checking and peer review and some of these mechanisms, is really, really important.
Ultimately, the skeptic wants to show that we do not know the things that we take ourselves to know. But what is knowledge? Knowledge demands true belief. In order to know that Paris is the capital of France, I must believe it, and it must also be true. If what I believe is false, then I can't know it. I might think that I know it, but thinking that one knows something and actually knowing it are not the same thing. But equally, no truth can count as my knowledge unless I believe it. But there is more to knowledge than just true belief. And that's because we can acquire true beliefs in all kinds of inappropriate ways. A lucky guess is not knowledge, for example. In order to have knowledge, one must have a true belief that is acquired in the right kind of way. Notice that even though knowledge demands truth, it doesn't demand infallibility. Our senses sometimes deceive us, as when a thirsty man in a desert hallucinates an oasis in the distance. This just reminds us that our senses are fallible. But that in itself doesn't mean that our senses cannot lead us to knowledge. That our senses are sometimes mistaken is not a reason to think that they always are mistaken. If knowledge doesn't demand infallibility, then what does it demand over and above true belief? While not all epistemologists, that's theorists about knowledge, agree about the details, the general consensus is that knowledge requires true belief that is grounded in good reasons. Think, for example, of someone who lacks knowledge because their true belief is just a lucky guess. What they lack are good reasons in support of their belief. Well, this means reasons for thinking that what they believe is true. In contrast, someone who has knowledge and who isn't merely guessing correctly will not just have a true belief, but will also be able to offer good reasons in support of their answer, such as an explanation of how they know. We can now see how one might go about motivating skeptical doubt. If doubt can be cast on whether one has good reasons in support of one's beliefs, then that would suffice to make one doubt whether one has knowledge. Notice that skepticism, so construed, needn't claim that any of one's beliefs are actually false. All that matters is that you lack good reasons in support of them, such that even if they are true, they don't amount to knowledge. This makes life a little easier for the skeptic, since there is less that they need to do. But we also noted that knowledge doesn't require infallibility, and this makes life a little harder for the skeptic too. This is because the skeptic cannot try to convince us that we lack good reasons for our beliefs by simply arguing that our reasons are fallible. So if you recall, this is one third topic that comes out in the MOOC. It's this idea that knowledge is being rationally grounded, as you need your beliefs have to have reasons in support of them. And I think this is the issue that's coming up here, that we need to, in order to be a knower, it's not just enough that one is right. One has to be right in the right kind of way. And that means that one is able to offer reasons, one is able to defend one's judgment. And that means there's a sort of performative aspect to knowing, as it were. You have to sort of engage in the public space of reasons. And this is a way of thinking about what skepticism is. It's a way of attacking those grounds, right? So it's a challenge, and being able to meet that challenge is part of what it is to be a knower.
I like your use of the word performative there, because I study theater, and theater is intrinsically dialogic. It involves people arguing and coming from very different life experiences and often representing different worldviews. And theater shares that with philosophy, which really began as an art of dialogue and conversation with the Socratic method. So I think that question of how we, by performing and trying on different points of view, we figure out where we stand in relationship to them is really, really important. It's one of the functions of the humanities, whether it's history, looking at the idea that different worldviews come from different structures of experience, different climates, different contexts, different languages, studying foreign languages, studying philosophy, reading literature, experiencing drama as that play of points of view, can be really great tools for this process of figuring out why we inhabit the beliefs that we do and imagining the counter-arguments and taking seriously those counter-arguments.
So just real quickly, I think this conversation goes something that, Howard, you started it off with. A danger in our current society is taking science as the only way of knowing. It is a way of knowing, and it works in its areas that it works, and it's a good model for recognizing that there are ways of knowing.
Right.
But it is not the only way of knowing. And if you don't participate and train yourselves in these other ways of knowing, there's whole ranges of your life that suddenly you're at a loss for a rational ground to make decisions. And so it's so critical. And that's a role, I think, in our current society, we seem to be losing as STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, really takes this center pedestal role, speaking as the scientist here, I find that dangerous, right? If we forget everything else you need to make society work, we're in big trouble.
Right. That knowledge encompasses much more than the scientific method. And, Duncan, you mentioned, in part, we're encouraged to think about the relationship between belief and knowledge, right? It's not enough just to have beliefs. What could be a little foreboding about that is, boy, oh boy, it's just really hard to have knowledge about so many things. Knowledge is a hard thing to come by, right? Yeah. And so we always have a certain ratio, given the amount, the bundle of beliefs and convictions we have. How many of those bundles of beliefs and convictions do we feel some sense of obligation to ground in a way where we can then claim that it's also a form of knowledge? And there's a lot of ways in which we don't care one way or the other if you like one kind of ice cream or another. You're not sitting around running a lot of experiments on which ice cream is objectively the right way. So a lot of our beliefs, we shouldn't have too much anxiety about transforming them into knowledge. What's interesting is now that I know I have a bundle of beliefs, and a lot of those beliefs are really not grounded in the way that you're talking about it, how do you begin to prioritize and triage? What beliefs should I worry about that are deserving of being more grounded? And it may be, by the way, beliefs about yourself and your worldview. So the unexamined life isn't as good as reflecting over and over just about what is important to you. It may be beliefs about how society should be organized. You can worry when you have government agencies that are supposed to make decisions based on some scientific peer review point of view, when many of those agencies are being prohibited from benefiting from that. Well, everybody has a point of view about what they would like to see, but the decisions that are being made that should be grounded in knowledge, both in your personal life and more broadly in society, are the ones that people should begin to focus on. And then hopefully, if you're a curious person, you have a lifetime of figuring out how many of your beliefs you can transform into something that you think is a form of knowledge.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, this goes back to this issue of values, right? But simply knowing that beliefs have to meet a certain standard to be knowledge isn't going to help you because, well, as you say, you can't do that for all your beliefs. They won't all meet that standard. So you need to know which ones are the important ones. That's a question of your values, right? That's what do you prioritize?
I think there's another dynamic there too, where not only do we vet our beliefs with knowledge, but our belief drives our search for knowledge. And this belief, and so I'll give you a really pragmatic example. I mentioned neuroplasticity and the doubt of neuroplasticity. Fast forward, there is no neuroplasticity, so we build robots that give rehabilitation therapy. Now, they benefit people, but only a small amount, 10 or 20%. So now there's a second way of saying, okay, there's neuroplasticity, but it's so small that it doesn't matter. So now do I believe that by applying the scientific method, trying hard, doing good engineering, that we will find better ways to drive that effect size up, right? So there's a sort of a belief I have to stay motivated to do my science, and then I seek to then rationally ground it. But there's an emotional content to it. We're not, and our beliefs sort of drive our search for knowledge, I think.
I like that. Yeah.
They drive our search for knowledge. The important beliefs you hope are they're motivating you to try to figure out important things. Things are important to you. Things are important to society. Yeah. Our beliefs also complicate our grounding in knowledge, right? Because beliefs so often are generated by, let's say, less well-grounded points of view, how you grew up, your emotional state. There's this great phrase that the economist Tyler Cowen coined called mood affiliation. And sometimes you just have a mood about something. I don't like people in power, or, I'm an anti-authoritarian, whatever it might be. And then any candidate idea that circulates in the ecosystem that most clearly attaches to your mood, you then embrace without sort of critical reflection. And so one of the things that if you are constantly striving toward grounding your knowledge in more rational, reasonable beliefs, is that you also have to overcome your own prejudices, your own points of view, your own sort of emotional frame of mind. Who was it? Einstein was positive that God didn't play dice with the universe, and he just was not going to allow himself to think that quantum mechanics was that thing. Well, it turns out he should have been a little more open-minded about it.
Well, sorry. I just got to give this quote. So I ran across two quotes, one by Richard Feynman, eminent physicist. He says, the first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool.
Right.
And then a quote by Martin Luther, the religious reformer, therefore we must strongly resist our own opinions.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
just of the two domains they recognize. And yeah, these are opinionated people.
That's a good point. That's right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, this is this great historical moment. You have people moving from trust, deferring to others, to trusting themselves, to realizing they can't even trust themselves. Right? So the scientific process has to be critically applied to themselves. And you can see this in the work of people like Bacon. So in fact, they're incorporating scientific, skeptical texts in their scientific thinking. That's what's happening at this point in history. So their skepticism about themselves is driven by a reawakening of these skeptical ideas from antiquity.
Well, and this great moment, sort of the Shakespearean moment plus, where there is this sense that the religious wars are, taking their toll, organizing society around certitude, around religious principles, may not be the best way. Not only is it tearing Europe and England apart, it is not allowing society to develop in a certain way. And I'm thinking of that there's this Shakespeare moment, there's this Martin Luther kind of moment, there's this Royal Society. There's a lot going on at that time, which was fundamentally transformative to human well-being. And so it's important for us to realize that if you were a little too dogmatic or a little too skeptical about the whole thing, a lot of what we take for granted as the measure of progress for the last couple of hundred years is therefore really called into question. So you better be pretty sure, if you're a radical skeptic, that you want to go all the way there.
I think one thing's interesting, a lot of these themes crop up in Shakespeare's plays. He seems to often working through these ideas. And I think this raises an interesting question about drama, about how the imaginative exercise of, as you say, being able to wear a different point of view, where take on a different clothes, as it were, intellectually, try them out.
Right.
That's really important. I mean, it's important to science. I mean, with this idea that you've got to see things from other people's points of view and so on, and consider alternative positions. But of course, in literature, I mean, it can be used in all kinds of subversive ways. It can be a way of challenging authority without directly challenging authority.
Right, and also pushing back against the radical skepticism, because I think Shakespeare was very influenced by the revival of skeptical texts, but they did tend to be what we would call moderate skeptical, Sextus Empiricus, for example, Montaigne. These are not nihilistic texts.
No.
These are texts that are experimenting with skeptical points of view, often in order to reaffirm one sense of being in the world and of not being a brain in a vat, to come to some of your terms. So I see a lot of this in Shakespeare around the issue of love, where you will have a character who is highly committed to a kind of idealized version of love, let's say Romeo, and then a character who has something more like a radically skeptical view of love and thinks that it's all hogwash and basic drives and hormones, Mercutio. And, the Romeo viewpoint ultimately wins in Shakespeare, but only because it passes through a kind of education and moderate skepticism in which characters, let's say like Rosalind and Orlando, and As You Like It, learn to temper the absolutism of love, which we might associate with conviction or dogma, with an openness to the foibles of lovers, that desire comes and goes, that affections are malleable, that marriage introduces new responsibilities that are different from what the young lovers experience in Romeo and Juliet. And we see that working out in comedy, where the skeptical and the idealistic are integrated, in tragedy, where there's a kind of failure of the integration, and in the great dramas of jealousy, where we see it's not so much conviction versus skepticism, but where conviction gets infected by skepticism and becomes conspiracy theory, where we see really the problems, let's say, of an Othello. And I think that really has a lot to teach us about the very strange relationship now between radical skepticism and relativism and conspiracy theories. I mean, I think that's what Shakespeare is diagnosing. And he does it through love because that's what people want to see on stage. But he's responding to the Reformation.
Right.
And the excesses of the Reformation, because he's not a radical Protestant. We might say he's an Anglican or, a middle way Protestant who is trying to keep the best of Catholic and Reform ideas, integrate them with humanism and skepticism in order to get to some kind of livable set of life tools that involve the intellectual and moral virtues.
Right. I was going to say Othello is a great case in point. It's almost the skeptical play, isn't it? Because it just shows how self-undermining the skepticism becomes eventually.
How world-destroying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Othello dies, his wife dies, and many relationships are destroyed in the play.
Yeah.
Does Hamlet have something especially interesting to say or reveal about?
Always.
Right? I mean, if we're going to do Othello, we could take a couple of seconds on Hamlet.
Well, I'd say that like a figure like Horatio and the friend in general in Shakespeare is a kind of figure of moderate skepticism. That Hamlet himself, let's say, starts going down the radical skeptical path in a speech like To Be or Not to Be.
Right.
Where the very, should I live in a vat or not? Should I dissolve all values in a kind of abyss?
Right.
And I think Horatio is the figure of ratio, of ratio, of reason, of a kind of a moderate skepticism. He is the friend who pulls Hamlet back from the edge of that radical skepticism. So that would be one way to think about Hamlet in this light, and that, for students out there, who are your friends?
Right.
Are your friends? Aristotle has wonderful things to say about friendship. Your friends don't let friends drunk drive, right? Friends don't let friends become radical skeptics.
I think we have a new bumper sticker.
They're going to be pushing back and trying to offer help, whether that's psychological help or rational help, or brochures, or but to try to counter the dangers of relativism, which do, I think, lead to conspiracy and to these kinds of paranoid fantasies that we see in a play like Othello.
Or even to just mere interest in will against interest in will, in a polity. Yes. So the framers of the American Republic think about how much they debated through public reason. That those years between the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. And when they were reflecting on the Constitution, it was first a deeply deliberative process and then a process of public deliberation, and there was almost this aspiration that they were trying to create a republic of reason. And the thing that you were talking about, how if there's too much skepticism, it's world destroying. They really thought that mere faction against faction, interest against interest, was what would tear a free and diverse society apart. And their hope in creating a bit of a system of checks and balances is that if all you tried to do was win by asserting your will, that wouldn't be successful. And if you could create enough frustration merely of interest against interest, and actually they were drawing, I think, on metaphors of the physical universe and cosmology. If you could have enough force against force, you might unleash then the capacity of a free people, especially if they were also an educated people, to then think through and talk through their issues. Because if a free society can talk through its disagreements and understand that even if in the short run you don't convince me, I have another shot at convincing you down the road, then what that means for avoiding violence and oppression is really quite extraordinary, at least as an idea, if not always as a lived experience. If you give up on the notion that we are in relationship to each other and we owe each other our reasons for those beliefs that affect our community life, if you give up on that, it's hard to imagine a society other than one of great chaos and violence. And so one of the reasons why I think there's reason to be concerned if there are moments in a political culture where it seems people don't care quite so much about engaging people, their fellow citizens, in conversation. If you're simply treating people as the enemy, if you're not interested in whether what you have to say is true or not true, the potentially devastating long-term effects that has for the very idea of a free society, I think can't be overestimated.
I think this is crucial because it's very tempting to think that the sort of relativist idea of anything goes can seem liberating at first glance. You know, like everyone's free to have their own opinions. Isn't it a kind of a way of respecting diversity of opinion? But ultimately, your opinion isn't respected at all if it's just merely a relative opinion, right? What it is to respect one's opinion is to rationally engage one another, and that means there's something to engage with. There is something there substantive to disagree about.
That's right. You know, we have a minor version of that issue on some college campus. Everybody's favorite topic is free speech on campus. And what I think concerns people when they see isolated cases of some members of the university community not wanting to engage on the other side is if you give up on the very idea that kind of engagement is a necessary precondition of even being part of this sort of community, you give up, the whole edifice can begin to collapse. And ultimately, we need to be able to count on each other as people that we can talk through disagreements with. And so we start with science and understanding what is knowable about the universe. I think you very quickly get to the foundations of a free and just society.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fantastic point on which to end our discussion for this module. Thanks very much to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In this module, we'll be examining an influential argument for a radical form of skepticism. This argument makes use of what is known as radical skeptical hypotheses, which are scenarios that are indistinguishable from everyday life, but where one is radically in error. As we will see, it seems to be in the nature of such hypotheses that we cannot rule them out. While radical skepticism doesn't follow from this claim alone, it does seem to follow from the combination of this claim and a very plausible principle regarding knowledge, what is known as the closure principle. We are thus presented with a powerful argument for the radical skeptical conclusion that knowledge, much of it anyway, is simply impossible. A key element of many arguments for radical skepticism are radical skeptical hypotheses. These are scenarios that have two key features. The first is that they are completely indistinguishable from everyday life. And the second is that they depict a situation in which most of what you believe is false. Here is one very famous type of radical skeptical hypothesis that you may be familiar with from popular Hollywood science fiction. Let's imagine that there are evil scientists who go about harvesting brains from bodies and keeping those brains alive in vats of nutrients where they're fed experiences by supercomputers. Crucially, the experiences that these brains in a vat are given are indistinguishable from everyday experiences. In addition, the brains in a vat have no memories of being abducted. This means that they are completely unaware that they are now living their lives entirely within the fake virtual environment created by the supercomputers. The brains in a vat thus have experiences as if they're walking around in their normal environment, interacting with friends, driving their cars to the shops and so on. And yet none of this is actually happening, since all of the experiences that they're having are manufactured by the machines. Accordingly, most of what they believe is false, and hence they don't know very much, if anything. Now, this is all very science fiction, of course, but no one is saying that this scenario is true or even likely. Right now, the skeptic is merely noting that this hypothesis is possible. That is, it's something that could happen, no matter how unlikely it might be. The skeptic now makes an important move, which is to point out that it is impossible to rule out a radical skeptical hypothesis. One cannot know that one is not a brain in a vat, for instance. For how would one go about knowing that one is not a brain in a vat, given that the experiences had in the vat are indistinguishable from everyday experiences? For example, it would clearly be pointless to note that you can see and feel your body right now, and hence conclude that you can't be a bodiless brain in a vat. Since, of course, the brain in a vat also has the same experiences you do as if they have a body. The upshot is that, for all we know, we could be brains in a vat. Does the mere fact that we do not know that we're not brains in vats license radical skepticism? No, not by itself at least. Knowledge doesn't demand infallibility. And that means that genuine knowledge is compatible with the possibility of being mistaken. More precisely, knowledge is compatible with the possibility of being mistaken so long as that possibility is remote. But the skeptic hasn't claimed that the radical skeptical hypotheses they propose are likely, or even that they are true. So what is to stop us from treating them as the far-fetched error possibilities that they appear to be? If that's right, then there seems nothing amiss with supposing that we know most of what we take ourselves to know. It is just that there are some error possibilities, those picked out by radical skeptical hypotheses, that we cannot know to be false. Unfortunately, as we will see, the radical skeptic is only just getting warmed up. The radical skeptic has argued that we cannot know that we are not the victims of radical skeptical hypotheses, like the brain of that scenario. But that seems entirely compatible with knowing much of what we take ourselves to know. That I know where I live, what I ate for breakfast today, what jersey I'm wearing, and so on. These are all things, by the way, that the brain in a vat doesn't know. So how can the radical skeptic use the claim that we can't rule out radical skeptical hypotheses to motivate their skeptical doubt? This is where the radical skeptic introduces a principle that at first blush can seem entirely innocuous, but which, as we will see, greatly strengthens their hand. Consider the following reasoning. Suppose you know the name of the capital of France begins with the letter P. Then aren't you also in a position to know that Madrid is not the capital of France? Or suppose you know that the single most populous country on the planet is China. Then aren't you also in a position to know that India is not the most populous country on the planet? The reasoning in play here looks harmless. And that's precisely because the inferences in play are so obvious, given what you know. What such inferences illustrate is that if you know one proposition, e.g., the capital of France begins with the letter P, and you know that this proposition entails a second proposition, e.g., that Madrid is not the capital of France, then you know that second proposition too. This is what epistemologists, or theorists of knowledge, as they're known, call the closure principle. And it looks obviously true. The problem, however, is that the radical skeptic can employ this seemingly harmless principle to motivate their skeptical doubt. For notice that just about any everyday claim that you take yourself to know is going to be inconsistent with some radical skeptical hypothesis or other. For example, right now I take myself to know that I'm wearing a shirt. But if it's true that I'm wearing a shirt, then it's also true that I'm not a brain in a vat. Since brains in vats don't have bodies, so they can't wear shirts. But that means that if I did know that I'm wearing a shirt, then I ought to be able to know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Conversely, if it really is impossible to know that I'm not a brain in a vat, then it follows that I can't know that I'm wearing a shirt. And what goes here for my supposed knowledge that I'm wearing a shirt will equally apply to a whole range of other everyday claims. The upshot is that if we did genuinely have the kind of everyday knowledge that we think we have, then, given the closure principle, we would be able to know the denials of radical skeptical hypotheses. But since we can't rule out these hypotheses, it follows that we don't have the kind of everyday knowledge that we think we have. The closure principle thus enables the skeptic to motivate their radical doubt. We are now in a position to put all the moving parts of the radical skeptical problem together. The radical skeptic is claiming that the following three claims are inconsistent, which means they can't all be true. The first claim is we're unable to know the denials of radical skeptical hypotheses. The second claim is the closure principle. And then the third claim is that we have lots of knowledge of everyday things, everyday claims. Now, we've seen that the first claim one is eminently plausible, that I can't know the denials of skeptical hypotheses. This is because these hypotheses are characterized in such a way that they're indistinguishable from normal life. Life in the vat is just like normal life out of the vat, even though most of the brain in the vat's beliefs are false. The second claim about the closure principle is also very plausible. Surely if one knows one proposition and knows that it entails a second proposition, then one must know the second proposition too. But as we have seen with these two claims in play, it seems that the third claim becomes unsustainable. If we did know the kinds of everyday things that we take ourselves to know, such as right now that I'm wearing a shirt, claims that we know are inconsistent with radical skeptical hypotheses, then it would seem to follow, via the closure principle, that we must be able to know the denials of radical skeptical hypotheses. But given that we cannot rule out these hypotheses, This means that we don't know the everyday claims either, in conflict with 3. So we can't consistently endorse all 3 of 1, 2, and 3. We are thus faced with a paradox. Radical skepticism as position would advocate resolving the paradox by denying the 3rd claim, by saying that we don't know many of the things we take ourselves to know. But that's absurd. But is it any less absurd than denying 1 or 2? Is it any less absurd than denying the closure principle, or saying that we can know the denials of skeptical hypotheses? Notice that this skeptical argument is not directed at the truth of our beliefs, but the reasons that we have or think we have in support of those beliefs. The skeptic is suggesting that we don't have any good reasons for our beliefs. Right now, I think I have all sorts of reasons for believing that I'm wearing a shirt, such as my current experiences, my memories, and so on. But all of these reasons are entirely compatible with being a shirtless brain in a vat. As if one were a brain in a vat, then would offer the very same reasons. This is precisely why we seem unable to rule out radical skeptical scenarios. But if my reasons for thinking that I'm wearing a shirt are entirely compatible with being a shirtless brain in a vat, then how are there any reasons at all? In particular, how could I know that I'm wearing a shirt on the basis of these reasons? Relatedly, notice that this skeptical argument doesn't presuppose that knowledge demands infallibility. The skeptic isn't claiming that we lack knowledge because we only have fallible reasons for our beliefs. Instead, they are claiming they have no good reasons for our beliefs at all, fallible or otherwise. In the last module, we set out a powerful argument for the radical skeptical conclusion that knowledge is impossible. In this module, we will be considering some responses to this argument. We'll begin by examining the idea that we can appeal to common sense as a way of resisting skeptical conclusions. Next, we will look at a contextualist response to skepticism, which maintains that we can evade the skeptical problem by recognizing that knowledge is a context-sensitive notion. Finally, we will explore the idea put forward by Wittgenstein that the very project of evaluating our beliefs en masse, as the radical skeptic proposes, is simply incoherent. Let's remind ourselves of the radical skeptical puzzle. The following 3 claims are all independently plausible, but they can't all be true. The first is that we're unable to know the denials of radical skeptical hypotheses. The second is the closure principle. And the third is the claim that we have lots of knowledge of everyday propositions. How should we respond to this puzzle? One very natural response to philosophical problems like this is to insist on our common sense principles and work back from there. If philosophy conflicts with common sense, then shouldn't the latter triumph over the former? One of the difficulties facing this approach, however, is that the skeptical puzzle doesn't seem to rest on anything but common sense. That is, the 3 claims that we have noted as being inconsistent all appear to arise out of our ordinary ways of thinking about knowledge. If that's right, then it seems that it is common sense itself that is generating the skeptical problem. Indeed, that's precisely why the skeptical puzzle seems to be a paradox, in that it is exposing a fundamental tension within our own ways of thinking about knowledge. But perhaps we can appeal to common sense in a different way. We don't normally consider radical skeptical hypotheses in everyday life, and everyday life is a default realm of common sense. So could we appeal to common sense to justify simply ignoring such hypotheses? The trouble with the suggestion, however, is that we actually do sometimes consider radical skeptical hypotheses in everyday life, as the movies indicate. Moreover, that we don't ordinarily consider certain error possibilities doesn't itself license us in ignoring them if they are salient. And the radical skeptic, via her appeal to the closure principle, does seem to have made at least a prima facie case for their saliency. Here's another go at appealing to common sense. Radical skepticism as a position endorses 1 and 2 in the skeptical puzzle, and hence denies 3. Couldn't we just use 3 as a common sense foundation from which to deny, via 2, 1 instead? Sure, we can't explain how 1 could be false, but given this is a paradox, then denying any of these claims is going to lead to mystery, so why not this one? The thought would be that there is a kind of impasse between these 2 approaches, with each of them evenly balanced against one another, but that appealing to common sense can break the deadlock. This approach gains some purchase on radical skepticism as a position, but not on radical skepticism as a paradox. Denying 1 rather than 3 probably is preferable from the perspective of common sense, but that hardly helps us explain why denying either of them is so counterintuitive. This means that if we do want to deny 1, then we'll need to explain why it is false. But given how very plausible one looks, how are we going to do that? A different kind of response to skepticism involves the thought that there is some sort of context shift in play in the skeptical reasoning. The idea is that the standards for knowledge shift with context, such that sometimes knowledge is very easy to satisfy, while at other times it is hard, if not impossible, to satisfy. If true, this could explain why our everyday usage of this term involves us inscribing lots of knowledge to each other, as in day-to-day context we use knowledge in a very undemanding way. Perhaps what happens when we engage with radical skepticism, however, is that we shift to employing it in its more austere way, in its more austere rendering. It would thus be no surprise that we find ourselves no longer widely attributing knowledge, since knowledge, the word, now means something far more restrictive than it did previously. Could the radical skeptical problem really turn on a shift of context in this way? As it happens, there are precedents for context sensitivity of this kind. Take a term like tall, for example. I'm 6'2", and hence, in most contexts, I would count as tall. But in the context of picking a basketball team, I probably wouldn't count as tall at all. There's no contradiction here. It's not that I'm simultaneously both tall and not tall. Rather, our assessments of tallness are usually made relative to a particular standard. At 6'2", I'm tall relative to the standard of average person height. But that's not tall at all relative to the standard of average basketball player height. What goes here for tall also applies to a range of other context-sensitive terms, like big, heavy, and so on. Perhaps the same is also true of knowledge. One advantage of this contextualist response to radical skepticism is that there's a sense in which both we're right and the skeptic is right. Our ordinary practices of ascribing knowledge to each other come out as correct, as they are implicitly picking out an undemanding standard for knowledge. But the radical skeptic is also correct to contend, relative to the demanding standard for knowledge that she employs, that we lack a lot of the knowledge that we take ourselves to have. It looked like we were arguing with each other, but on this view, we are simply using the word knowledge in different ways. But just how plausible is it that the radical skeptical problem could turn on a simple feature of language like this? No one has ever been led astray by the fact that tall can be used in very different ways in different contexts of use. So how would we ever get taken in by a skeptical puzzle that simply trades on different contextual uses of knowledge? Moreover, it is crucial to contextualism that we satisfy some epistemic standard for knowledge, albeit only a weak one. The problem, however, is that radical skepticism seems to exclude even this possibility. Remember that the skeptic's claim is that since we can't rule out radical skeptical hypotheses, we have no good reasons at all for believing what we do. But if that's right, then it would seem to follow that we don't satisfy any standard for knowledge, not even the weakest standard imaginable. Accordingly, appealing to standards for knowledge doesn't help us with the skeptical problem at all, as we don't even count as having knowledge in undemanding everyday contexts. Very roughly, knowledge is rationally grounded true belief. How do we determine whether a belief is rationally grounded? Normally we do so by evaluating that belief against a backdrop of other beliefs which we take to be knowledge. This is the sense in which rational evaluations are normally local, and that we're not rationally evaluating all of our beliefs all at once, but only a subset of those beliefs relative to a wider set of beliefs that are not in doubt and which are thus treated as knowledge. In contrast, the radical skeptic's rational evaluations are not local in this way, but global. The radical skeptic is trying to determine whether our beliefs as a whole enjoy rational support and so amount to knowledge. That's just the point of introducing radical skeptical scenarios, since these are situations in which our beliefs are massively in error. It's also why we can't appeal to our background knowledge in order to rule them out, as the global nature of the skeptical scenario means that it calls our background knowledge into question as well. Interestingly, it's not just the radical skeptic who attempts to rationally evaluate our beliefs as a whole, since this is also true of the traditional anti-skeptic too. While the radical skeptic rationally evaluates our beliefs as a whole in a negative fashion, and so finds them wanting, the traditional anti-skeptic rationally evaluates our beliefs as a whole with a view to producing a positive verdict. They want to show these beliefs amount to knowledge, contra the radical skeptic. This is where a rather distinctive response to skepticism, due to Ludwig Wittgenstein, comes in. His basic idea is that both the radical skeptic and the traditional anti-skeptic are employing a faulty conception of the nature of rational evaluation. In particular, he claimed the very idea that one could undertake a global rational evaluation is simply incoherent. The reason why Wittgenstein made this claim was that he thought that all rational evaluations necessarily take place against a backdrop of primitive but absolute certainties, what are known as hinge certainties. Given that the hinge certainties need to be in place in order for rational evaluations to occur, it follows that they cannot themselves be rationally evaluated. They are neither rational nor irrational, but irrational. Accordingly, to treat them as rationally valuable, as the skeptic and traditional anti-skeptic do by undertaking global rational evaluations, is to misunderstand their special role. Wittgenstein thus attempts to invert radical skepticism by using the fact that we cannot give an ultimate rational basis for our beliefs against the skeptic. The big problem facing Wittgenstein's proposal, however, is to explain why it doesn't just collapse into radical skepticism. If our rational evaluations presuppose hinge certainties that are lacking in rational support, then doesn't that just mean that our beliefs are ultimately groundless? And doesn't that in turn entail that we don't know anything, just as the radical skeptic contends? In this final module, we'll be considering how one might make a case for a moderate skepticism that has none of the troubling ramifications of radical skepticism. To that end, we will be considering an important philosophical idea that we get from the ancients, and from Aristotle in particular. This is that the good life, the life of human flourishing, or eudaimonia as the ancient Greeks called it, is a life of virtue, where this includes specifically intellectual virtues. As we will see, a moderate skepticism seems to go hand in hand with intellectual virtue. Moreover, we will also explain how manifesting such virtuous skepticism is entirely compatible with living a life of conviction. We began this course by noting a distinction between a moderate and a radical form of skepticism. While moderate skepticism is the antidote to gullibility and is thus to be encouraged, radical skepticism has troubling ramifications, not least in that it creates the fertile ground in which relativism prospers. We have seen that some of the rationales for radical skepticism are highly dubious. For example, the undeniable fact that we are fallible creatures who are sometimes in error does not in itself offer a justification for radical skepticism. Moreover, notice that where we have offered reasons for taking radical skepticism seriously, these are not the kinds of reasons that those who espouse radical skeptical ideas in public life offer, since they typically offer no reasons at all. There is a good explanation for this, which is that it's hard to make sense of radical skepticism as a stance. What should we make of someone who claims not to believe anything? The person who claims to be skeptical about science, for example, is usually quite content to receive first-world healthcare. The point is that such radical skepticism is in an important sense fake. The same goes for relativism. Those who espouse relativist ideas do not in practice abandon an objective conception of truth. For example, do you think they would be so sanguine about what's objectively true if it were the taxman declaring that they had to pay more than they owe? Rather, they want to trick us into giving up on a concern for what is objectively true in order to enable them to get their own way. Relativism, far from being used to challenge authority, is almost always employed instead to underpin existing power structures in society. In any case, the positive argument for radical skepticism that we looked at was powerful precisely because it was primarily put forward not as a position, but as a paradox. That is, as exposing deep tensions within our own concept of knowledge. As we saw, the radical skeptical paradox can be coherently posed even if the radical skeptical position of claiming that we don't know anything is incoherent. The muddled thinking of those who espouse radical skeptical and relativistic ideas in public life is thus no less muddled because there is a genuine philosophical puzzle regarding whether we have knowledge. In what follows, we will put radical skepticism to one side and consider instead how one might make a positive case for a moderate skepticism. To this end, we will be looking at an idea that we get from the ancients. This concerns the role of the virtues, and the intellectual virtues in particular, in the good life of human flourishing, what the Greeks called eudaimonia. One thing we're going to talk about here is how moderate skepticism could be part of a virtuous life, a good life, a life of flourishing, what the Greeks called eudaimonia. The virtues for the Greeks were these character traits which lay between two vices, a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. So we could think of the intellectual virtues as being kinds of good character traits which are devoted to intellectual ends, to a love of truth and similar such goods, intellectual goods. And we could think of them as being opposed to the vices of excess and deficiency. And you can see this with moderate skepticism. It looks very much like a virtue. It lies in between, on the one hand, the deficiency, which would, in this case would be gullibility, and on the other hand, the excess, which would be a radical skepticism, which is not a good thing, not a good character trait, it's a self-undermining trait. So we're interested in this module, this idea of moderate skepticism as this virtuous trait, as helping us lead a good life. And one question that we asked here is how to square that thought with the idea of conviction as being important to a good life, because conviction does seem to be an essential part of a good life. And one way that I tried to tease this out was to draw a contrast between what seems to be the skeptical virtue of being intellectually humble and conviction. Can it be that we can square the two? Isn't it to be intellectually humble to be sort of downgrading of oneself, to not have conviction? But if that's right and it's a virtue, then doesn't that mean the virtuous life can't involve conviction? And I tried to square this circle by suggesting that actually when you think about what intellectual humility involves and what moderate skepticism involves as a virtue, it's not about a downgrading of oneself. It's rather tells us something important about how we should treat others, how we should respect reasons and truth, and thereby intellectually respect others in our engagements with one another. And once you think of it that way, it's entirely compatible with having conviction. So the thought is that the good life, the virtuous life, which involves moderate skepticism, can also involve conviction too. Okay, so now I'm going to throw this out to our panelists. So Dave, if I could start with you. I just mentioned this idea of intellectual humility, something which I was suggesting is a virtue. Taking a non-dogmatic stance.
Right.
And in that way embodying a moderate skepticism in one's life.
Yeah.
How do you find this manifesting itself in the scientific enterprise?
When I read what you wrote, this intellectual humility triggered a phrase that I've become aware of, which is intellectual hospitality. And this was taught to me, has had a profound effect on me. But the idea is that you could entertain ideas without accepting them. And that you could, even to the extent that you could argue the idea to the satisfaction of the person who holds it, even though you don't hold the idea.
Yeah.
And I think if we could relax and take that on, it promotes a sort of conversation that's just fun and mind expanding. Just to be able to step into the shoes of someone else and make the argument from their point of view. And I think it's sadly lacking. It's extremely rare.
Yeah.
And it's a discipline. It sort of has to be done intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that drama is one way of promoting that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, that sounds like what I do.
Okay.
Because, entertaining ideas is what both drama and other forms of literature really are about. And we see this in Shakespeare when a character has to take on a disguise to survive. But in taking on that disguise, let's say a young woman having to disguise herself as a young man, in taking on that disguise, she is also taking on a different set of mannerisms and ways of looking at things, and it might open up elements of herself that she wasn't aware of. And it also allows her to interact with others in ways that can lead them to also entertain ideas. So if we look, for example, at Rosalind in Orlando and As You Like It, where she pretends to be a boy, and she also pretends to be a skeptic about love in order to educate her oversmitten boyfriend in a more moderate way of loving, but also to educate herself in a more moderate way of loving. And so they entertain each other, they entertain us. She's really exercising the virtue of wit. And wit in the Renaissance was a much broader concept than simply humor. It included humor, but also really meant intelligence. It could mean reason. It could mean phronesis or practical judgment. And so the wittiness of this act of entertaining is sort of everywhere in evidence, and I think is one of the great virtues or affordances or resources of drama and literature. and why we need to incorporate those into our education, but also into our lifelong learning, because they allow us to practice that intellectual hospitality and to witness intellectual hospitality being exercised or not by different, characters on stage or in books.
John Stuart Mill has this, you probably remember the quote better than I do even, but one of his favorite quotes that free speech advocates often use is, he said, if all you know is your side of the argument and not the argument of your critic, then you don't even know your side of the argument.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, it's not, and his test was, it's not until you could explain the other side to someone with complete conviction, it's not until that happens that you really understand. And so when we're thinking about what is it that grounds our beliefs, we can't always do with respect to every belief we have the scientific method, but you can at least test yourself whether you understand what other people are saying. So intellectual hospitality is also a way for you to see whether you really know something at the level that you could claim it's not just a belief, but also some form of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And just real quickly, I think that goes to one of the misunderstandings of conviction in today's public discourse, because it's a little sad to me how often you hear people complain or criticize about a piece of literature or a play or a drama that they're presenting a horrible point of view as if it's true, when really what they're doing is exploring that point of view so that you can understand it, so then you can see perhaps why it is horrible, right? And if you don't actually explore it to its fullness, you may not have that complete confidence. And it's interesting how sort of loath we are right now in our public discussion to entertain some of those views, to see them discussed in a very robust way.
Right.
The ancient Greeks were very much concerned with the ethical question of how one ought to live. They wanted to know what constitutes the good life of human flourishing, what they called eudaimonia. Aristotle approached this question by appealing to the virtues. These are admirable character traits like courage, generosity, and kindness. The virtues have a number of interesting properties. For instance, they lie in opposition to two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. The lack of courage, cowardice, is a vice. But one can also take excessive risks and thereby exhibit the very different vice of being rash or foolhardy. Being courageous is thus being disposed to act between these two extremes, what Aristotle called the golden mean. We are not born with virtues, but must acquire them through practice, especially by emulating those around us who have these admirable traits. Virtues also involve distinctive kinds of motivations. Someone who has the virtue of generosity, for example, will be genuinely motivated to help others. Merely acting as if one is generous in order to impress, for example, is not the same thing as being virtuous. Aristotle held the good life as the virtuous life. This doesn't mean that a virtuous life will always involve pleasure, or that it will be a life without conflict and suffering. The point is rather that the way to confront such ills is by being armed with the virtues. Moreover, facing these difficulties in such a virtuous manner is far better than being insulated from them in an empty life of meaningless pleasure. These days, we tend to think of the virtues in specifically moral terms. Some of the virtues, like kindness and generosity, do seem to be particularly moral. Aristotle didn't think that having such moral virtues was enough, however, as one also needed to have the intellectual virtues too. Living the good life, after all, means knowing what to do, and that means having good intellectual character traits, such as being intellectually conscientious and open-minded. So, for example, to be intellectually conscientious is to form one's beliefs by attending to all the relevant evidence and being able to appropriately weigh up this evidence in reaching a decision. It is such a trait that we'd want in a judge who is hearing our trial, or in a doctor who is making a decision about whether we needed an operation. We have noted previously that there would be something absurd about trying to actively embrace radical skepticism. But even if we could make sense of it, there is now the further point that such a life of doubt would not be the good life. How could one manifest the virtues if one doubts everything? Interestingly, however, while the virtues are incompatible with a radical skeptical life, they seem to actively license moderate skepticism. Isn't it part of what's involved in such intellectual virtues as being conscientious or open-minded that one adopts a cautious, undogmatic approach to the evidence? I think some people might find it surprising to hear scientists talk about this idea of intellectual hospitality precisely because they think scientists are quite dogmatic. You know, we found the truth. There's nothing else to be said.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would imagine this is a challenge that you face, Michael, when you engage in trying to sort of popularize science, trying to explain it.
It is, and it's a challenge from two sides. I hate to say this. In popularizing science, it's a challenge from the public and from sometimes my fellow scientists, because you have to hit a sweet spot of, stating the things we are fairly confident in without going into too many of the caveats, because then people lose interest and get bored. Mm-hmm. But if you don't put enough of the caveats, your colleagues attack you for not putting on... You mentioned in an earlier module the idea of error bars, right? In physics and science in general, we are much more interested in sharing why we think we're wrong than the right answer to each other. Yeah. The public would like to know what we think is the current best answer. And so it's a completely different way of talking. When you talk at a scientific meeting, you share the answer you think is correct, and then you share all the reasons why it might be wrong and what you've done to explore it and why you're still reasonably confident. And the focus is on the caveats. If you do that with the public, you lose them.
Right.
Sure.
Right? And so in the public discussion, but also if you get too dogmatic and just say we're right because I'm right, and don't give them any sort of intuition to believe it, you're in trouble. When I talk to the public, one of the things I often, particularly if I'm doing anything particularly complicated, quantum mechanics, relativity, abstract ideas, I remind them that one of their challenges will be they don't have an intuition for the phenomenon I'm about to talk about. And if you don't have an intuition for something, I've learned it's very hard to believe it. Mm-hmm. Right? Most people go with their intuition as their first kind of line of defense. And so I point out that the English words I'm using probably mean exactly what they think they mean. There isn't some sneaky, complicated science thing behind it. They just don't have an intuition for it in that context. And they need to build that muscle. And there's a discipline there in learning more about science, which is using those words over and over and building your confidence in the fact that the scientists are using them the way the English words are meant to be used. So there's a lot of challenges in communicating science around this nervousness about conviction, dogmatic truth, questioning.
I think many people don't understand that aspect of science, that like a scientific paper does consist of saying, here are all the limitations, here are all the caveats, right? They think the scientific paper would just be, here's the truth.
Right, exactly.
Take it or leave it.
I'm an engineer. I'll put the engineer hat on too. With engineering, you have the benefit that the technology, the science plays itself out into a technology, and then you see, does it change the world or not? And it sort of validates itself or not. And I looked up a few predictions, and you can see this tension between sort of hope and belief, and then self-doubt. So just let me give you a couple of these. So I predict the internet will soon go spectacularly supernova, and in 1996 catastrophically collapse. That's the inventor of the Ethernet, Robert Metcalfe.
Wow.
So self-doubt. There's no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. Ken Olsen, founder of the legendary mini computer company DEC. So there's this kind of doubt that looks ludicrous now, right? And then here's this sort of self-promotion. There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. This is Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, right? So
wishful thinking.
Yeah. So I think I can relate to this tension where you want to have conviction and authority, but then there's this self-doubt, and it's a balance. To be a scientist or engineer, constantly there's a balance trying to measure out those two things.
Yeah, and I think a big challenge is knowing what I would call useful convictions, right? In science, physics is I think a good example of this. As I said earlier, there's principles that we have just seen be true for so long, and like technology, are just incredibly useful. And those are our go-to principles. And we have strong convictions in them. I once actually met with someone who was trying to explain their perpetual motion machine to me.
And they believed it?
They believed it, and it was an interesting process. And one of the reasons they believed it was they had actually got a meeting with NASA scientists who they said, well, they couldn't explain to me why it failed. And And there was a little bit of a difference of approach. The NASA scientists were trying to find it was a very complicated device. They were trying to find the step at which it failed. I said, look, I just know the second law of thermodynamics is correct. So I know your device is wrong. And I do not have to point to the step at which it breaks down. You have made a very complicated set of arguments. Finding the exact step where it breaks down is very, very hard. But I know if you build it, it will fail. And that was a weird use of conviction on my part, but it's a piece of evidence that just has survived hundreds of years.
Right.
And until they actually build it and I turn out to be wrong and make millions of dollars,
is in the back of your mind, though, are you thinking like relativity and Newtonian mechanics? Because you could say Newtonian mechanics, but someone discovered something else to violate it, or superseded it, right?
But that's an interesting other subtle point, just to get technical. In science, we've seen lots of expansions of ideas, superseding ideas, but one of the fascinating things is Newtonian mechanics, which survived for hundreds of years. Anything that replaces it has to actually capture it as well. Because the experiments it was grounded in haven't gone away. So its predictions have to be included in the next level up. So that's also why something like the second law of thermodynamics, to me, has been around long enough that we might get something radically different, but it's not going to be completely blown away. And so you can live in this. To go back to the idea of virtues, you can have the virtue of conviction if the convictions are always tested a little bit. You know that you have to have that intellectual humility about them, that something might change them, but you move along, with it, or you can't function, right? If you don't have convictions, you can't function.
Well, and here's where the common use of these words, we're talking about such big concepts: knowledge, conviction, sometimes truth, and dogmatism and skepticism. And you said a while ago, if you don't have an intuition about it, it's hard for people to believe it. Well, when we talk about knowledge or conviction, all of everyone's emotional intuitions behind that is that we're talking about the truth, something permanent, something for sure is going to happen. And so part of, I think, the opportunity of the module is to get people to hear words like knowledge and conviction and separate it from this sort of shorthand of, therefore you can never be wrong. That you only possess knowledge if you possess some eternal truth. So we're doing a little bit of redefinition or maybe clarification of the terms of the debate. And once you do that, then, even, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. There's a philosophical tradition that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And within science, the more you get into a topic, you could see it's much more complicated than you imagined. So knowledge can also have a relationship to humility, right? You sometimes think that knowledge leads you to certitude and to authority. But within the scientific tradition, we like talking more about falsifying things than verifying things, And it's true, the bridge either has to stay up or it's not going to stay up. So some things sort of teach themselves. But what is actually happening, I think, within our community is you have this kind of loop of curiosity. You got to start by wondering what might be true about something. And then you engage in some form of inquiry and to try to figure it out. And then sometimes that leads to discovery. But after discovery is always skepticism. And then that brings you back to curiosity, inquiry, discovery, skepticism. And if you think about the engagement with knowledge production as that kind of loop, rather than as stopping with discovery and certainty, I think you're a little bit closer to what we're trying to get at than if you think of knowledge as the one wise person who has all the answers.
I think one way to think about this is this idea, which from the previous module, of knowledge is rationally grounded, where those reasons are by their nature fallible reasons, right? They're not that's what reasons are. The idea of a reason that ends all inquiry is not no reason at all, right? Reasons are the kinds of things they're always open to challenge. And in being open to, that's because they're fallible, and being open to challenge means there's always going to be potentially counter reasons, a further discussion to be had about the status of those reasons. We've seen how the intellectual virtues could be an essential part of a life of flourishing, a good life. We've also seen how a moderate skepticism could be viewed as playing its part in this regard. One way of putting this point is in terms of the virtue of intellectual humility. Being intellectually humble, rather than dogmatic, seems precisely the kind of virtue that manifests a moderate skepticism. There is a problem facing this proposal, however. For don't we also treat conviction as being crucial to a good life? Isn't it important to have the strength of one's convictions and not simply abandon one's most cherished beliefs at the first sign of dissent? Indeed, isn't such conviction crucial to the virtue of intellectual courage? But how can we square the importance of conviction to the good life with the apparently opposing role that we have described for moderate skepticism and thus intellectual humility? This tension between intellectual humility and conviction arises because we are supposing that the former, intellectual humility, means having a downgraded assessment of one's intellectual abilities and achievements, such that one lacks confidence in one's beliefs, at least when it comes to issues where there is disagreement. This is not a very plausible way of thinking about intellectual humility, however. The key problem is that it makes intellectual humility too inwards focused, rather than being focused on others. What makes someone intellectually humble is not whether they are willing to downgrade their confidence in their beliefs, but rather the respectful way in which they intellectually engage with other people, whether they are willing to listen to alternative viewpoints, to explain the reasons they have for their own opinions, to rationally debate the subject in hand, and so on. Once we understand this point about intellectual humility, then the apparent tension with conviction disappears. Suppose one has thought through the issues behind one's views in great detail, and is then confronted with someone who has opposing views, but who has clearly not put as much thought into their position. Being intellectually humble doesn't mean that one cannot retain one's confidence in one's opinions. What it does mean, however, is that one should be intellectually respectful of the other person and their opinions. That intellectual humility is compatible with conviction is crucial to the modern world we live in. Not all points of view are rational or par. And that means that the intellectually virtuous should be willing to defend their opinions when necessary and not simply capitulate in the face of disagreement. Especially when it comes to the public life, to the defense of our political institutions, of the authority of science, and so forth. We need the virtue of intellectual courage. What is also vital, however, is that we manifest that courage in ways that are respectful of others, and that requires intellectual humility. We can thus incorporate moderate skepticism into our lives in an intellectually virtuous way without losing the strength of our convictions in the process. So once you think of it that way, that knowledge is fallible is not a reason to think that it's not real knowledge. That's just what knowledge is. Just as that's what science is. Science, it's not that there's a problem with science that it doesn't get to the truth and stop, but keeps going. Well, that's just because of the nature of the scientific enterprise, right?
So it's more like the most well-grounded belief under the circumstances, rather than sort of latching on to truth.
Yeah. I think that's right.
So how do we get from that to a way of life? Because I think that's a really important question. And I think, for me, trust is a really important virtue or attitude or stance to add into here, because trust it's neither gullibility, where it's simply naive trust, nor is it being responsible to know everything that one knows, but to be able to delegate some knowledge, to delegate some of these intuitions in order to be able to build one's own expertise and livable life, knowing that certain processes are being taken care of and have a rationality and a foundation to them. And I think, we have a terrible breakdown in trust now in our society. And Shakespeare's plays are often very interested in how trust gets destroyed and how a world without trust becomes absolutely unnavigable. If you break the rules of hospitality in Macbeth and the rules of politics and kinship and kingship, and you have a surveillance state, no one trusts anyone, and it becomes impossible to move forward to do any kind of personal or collective project. And trust is interesting because it's a word that's related to truth, but it's not exactly the same as truth. So,
well, I really like something you said about not being naive trust.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's a lot of what we're discussing here is what moderate skepticism helps you build is a more nuanced version of words like conviction, trust, knowledge, that aren't the absolute versions of them that I think often people take intuitively and worry about, but are the slightly more flexible versions that you need to actually just live and function and have a good life. Right? If you never trust, you're going to be in trouble.
This is the problem again of jealousy.
Right, but if you trust blindly and stupidly, you might also be in trouble.
Right, and you can put details on that, I think, is what's happening in the scientific community right now. So what are the reasons that we might not trust things or trust ourselves? And, here's a quote, many motivations distort what inferences we draw from data. These include the desire to support one's theory, to refute one's competitors, to be first to report a phenomenon, or simply to avoid publishing odd results. So, even in science, we start applying scientific method to understand where the bias comes and the way that we present our work, and we become suspicious of ourselves.
Our motives,
right?
And that relates to virtue and what it means to be intellectually virtuous. Are you pursuing your scholarship or your research for reasons that are self-interested?
Well, we all are, right? Our whole system is set up that way.
But when does that self-interest start deforming
That's
the
exactly
results
right.
and the way that we train new scholars and researchers, new scientists?
Well, and universities that have robust research agendas also have, as you all know very well, extraordinary rules and regulations around conflict of interest, conflict of commitment.
Right.
And part of that is mindful about how easy it is to corrupt the mechanisms of inquiry. Right. And while there's no such thing as a completely disinterested position, I think that the trust of such a community is that inquiry is motivated by our personal best efforts in light of how we've been trained and what we know to try to relay to the world what we have found out. And that we're not doing it because someone is, putting, our arms behind our back and sort of forcing us into a new position, that those positions are based on free minds interested in knowledge generation. Doesn't always work out that way. I mean, think about how easy it is if you found out that, the tobacco industry funded all of this research back in the day that, indicated that cigarette smoking wasn't quite so bad. And, but I think that feels corrupting because you can imagine an alternative where at least the people trying to figure that out at least don't have that corrupting dimension to the work that they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
I think what's interesting is this, the trust for it to be virtuous has to be grounded in the same way conviction for it to be virtuous has to be grounded. Doubt, if it is to be virtuous, has to be grounded. But that means that the skepticism can't be radical because that would destroy even the basis for the trust or the basis for the doubt or the basis for the conviction. So it's this idea, I think, radical skepticism often, either it's just simply fake, it's like a sort of a stance. And I think relativism is often like this. People are relativists in ways where it's convenient to them, but not when it's not convenient. Same as skepticism. But where radical skepticism really does start to become genuine, and this comes across in some Shakespeare plays, we mentioned Othello in the previous panel discussion, it actually has this incredibly personally destructive force. It becoming societally destructive, but also personally destructive. It's psychologically disorientating. And this reveals the fact that the virtuous life involves certain kinds of commitments. And one of those is commitments to reason. This isn't as it were an optional part of a good life. Or a life of reason is part of what it is to lead a good life.
Right. Aristotle says something like the good life is the action of the soul in accordance with reason. Yeah. And there's that element there of the soul, of passion, of a kind of a full human being. Who is, connected to other forms of life. And of course, Aristotle was a scientist as well as a philosopher. And but the element of reason there being very, very key, that the virtue can't simply be automatic or instinctive. It does have to unfold according to criteria that are learned and tested and can be made legible to others. So I think that's really important.
Something you had asked that goes into that in the beginning, right, is conviction and moderate skepticism compatible in a virtuous life? And I can't see how you could have a virtuous life without both, right? And you see that in the excess of conviction often. I feel like in the public debate, often politicians are held up to a standard of conviction that's irrational, right? That it's almost a litmus test. Are you a good politician if you never change your mind? Yeah. Despite the fact that, of course, they're always changing their position anyway. but right, that's often the first criticism an opponent will lay against someone, well, you don't have any convictions, you change your mind, even if the changing of the mind was rationally motivated and came out of moderate skepticism, right? So the two go together. And if, as I've said, you know, in the examples I give in physics, but even in everyday life, at some point you have to make decisions, right? At some point it's not enough to just sit there and go back and forth.
Right.
You do need to move forward, and that can only happen with some level of conviction, right? Now, it may be a very humble conviction. You may be very willing to change it quickly, or you may think it's going to last a long time. Your degree of conviction may vary, but the act of making a decision is committing to something, which only happens if you have the ability to have conviction. So those two, I liked your cycle discussion, Howard, right? Like you go through these stages and you reach a conviction, you make some actions, you have decisions, you move forward with it, but you don't stop examining the conviction just because you've used it.
Right. You do the best you can under the circumstances, which, by the way, is what everybody does every hour of the day, you know, and it's not just when you're generating big knowledge. I mean, you have a sense of whether if you walked in front of the speeding car, whether you would get hit or not, right? Or whether if you didn't watch your steps, you would fall down the stairs. It turns out, and, you know, it's mentioned in some of the other modules, it's just genuinely not possible to be a radical skeptic.
Right.
It is a truly unlivable frame of mind to have.
Right.
So then it gets interesting. What are we really kind of talking about? And I think that for a lot of people, it is the impulse for whatever reason to destroy the bonds of trust that enable people to have faith to talk about whether there are good reasons to believe some things rather than others. And we can tell not just through Shakespeare's dramatizations, but through what happens in totalitarian societies. If one of the things you want to do is isolate and terrify and oppress a free people, I mean, the first thing you do, of course, is that you lock up all the intellectuals, you lock up all of the mechanisms for independent information. You know, it's the universities and the journalists and the free thinkers and the artists that first you have to separate. And then you call into question everyone who has a different point of view by claiming that it's part of a foreign conspiracy. And it turns out the best way to terrorize and oppress a population is to instill in them a radical skepticism, which the thing it does is break the bonds of trust that people can have conversation. And that
you doubt your neighbor, you doubt your
neighbor.
children,
That's right, exactly
you doubt
right.
your spouse.
Right, whether any relationship is an authentic relationship,
Exactly.
because they might be calling up the secret police.
Right.
I think this is a key point because it's very tempting to think radical skepticism as being a way of subverting authority, and yet in fact, in practice, it promotes authority. It allows illegitimate authority to prosper because it removes any way of puncturing that authority through reason, because it takes away the very thing that would challenge authority.
You know, moderate skepticism is consistent with democratic politics, and radical skepticism is consistent with authoritarian politics.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true. And we see this in Shakespeare. The tyrants are all radical skeptics.
Right.
Tyranny and skepticism are identical.
Identical. That's right.
So in terms of the public education of science, one scenario that interests me is the case where you've got the expert confronting the non-expert.
Right.
The expert rationally should have conviction in their beliefs because they're the expert, right? And they are engaging with someone who may be challenging them who isn't the expert. How do they manifest their virtue now? This is what the sort of the challenge I could see between the two, because the people's perception is, well, or a common perception anyway, is if you're the expert, well then you ought to be dogmatic, and if you ought to be dogmatic, then you should be dismissive of these. You know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So how do you manifest virtue? How do you manifest these virtues of reason in a case where manifestly you ought to consider yourself the expert, right? I mean, that's what reason demands.
You know, I really think it comes back to something David said about intellectual hospitality, because I look historically where scientists have actually gotten themselves in trouble by being overly dogmatic early, right? And a good example is climate change, to be honest. I am of the opinion that scientists, as great as we are at many things, are not necessarily the best sort of marketing people in the world or, sort of public relations people. And early in that process, I don't think there was the appropriate intellectual hospitality where you kind of present your expertise and your convictions in an appropriate framework that's understandable. Of yes, these are the spaces where we may not be quite right yet, but this is the direction it's going. If we are wrong, here's the downside. It's not very big. It's this. If we're right, here's the downside. It's very big. We're going to continue pursuing this. You need to know why we're still pursuing it. You need to know why we think this is, a conviction that we have, and be willing to give some reasons. And you need to understand deeply why people might be opposed to this. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges is humans, we often hold a range of convictions. And if one of our convictions gets challenged, we're afraid we're going to lose the others, right? And this one may be important to us, but this one over here may be really important to us. And if I, as the person discussing things, and I'm attacking this conviction of yours, don't understand the fact that you see them as related, I'm going to be in trouble in that conversation. Yeah. I really need to understand your full range of convictions and how my statement is threatening you. So I can see what you're saying, that people would look to the scientists to just say yes. The problem is, in early stages of scientific knowledge, there's probably some other scientist who is convinced it's the other side. And you might have, it was the classic thing, 100 on one, one on the other. Now as the public, which voice do I listen to? So I see that temptation, and I understand why you're thinking about it, but for me, it always comes back to this intellectual hospitality, understanding the position you're trying to be in reference to, and making sure you're acknowledging the full spectrum of what you're going against. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that's very helpful.
Well, and in different domains, a person's encounter and interaction with a expert plays out differently, right? So if you have general interest and questions about big scientific questions like global climate change, you don't sit down. You see a debate played out in the national media, and you can dismiss it or not. We would encourage people, before you dismiss it, do you actually have grounds for dismissing it? Have you actually looked into it? This is one of those important things that you shouldn't just have a belief about. You should try to get some more knowledge about. But think about the interaction when you're with your physician. And, there are physicians that might be overly authoritarian in their interaction with their patient. That if a patient has a circumstance and you go to your physician because you trust they know something that you don't know, right? And that's when the stakes are high and very personal, and you don't want to screw it up. And quite often what you're going to realize is that even the most expert aren't going to overpromise necessarily. They might be a little confident in their ability to do it more than someone else's ability to do it. But you quickly find out in those interactions that the person you're trusting is often honest with you, that our information is impartial, there's a little bit of an art to this. This is the best we know right now. And I think it shows that when it really matters, you get an encounter with expertise and conviction that does display the kind of appropriate modesty that you're hoping for as a model for how we should all think about what it means to have conviction and knowledge.
Yeah. So one issue I want to return to here, which you brought up earlier, Julie, when you were talking about trust, was this idea of the intellectual virtues and their role in a life of flourishing. I think a lot of people are maybe familiar with the moral virtues. And one thing that's interesting about Aristotle, but this also comes up in Shakespeare too, is this idea of a good life is not just being a moral life, but also there's an intellectual component to it as well. In fact, actually, there's a practical component too. You have to be, it's practically orientated. You've got to be able to achieve things and do things. And I think this is, the issue of trust brings that out quite nicely. That the good life involves certain kinds of intellectual commitment, and that's what makes it a good life. This is something you find in the works of Shakespeare.
Absolutely, and again, I would look back to that notion of wit as being something very broad and humane, and involving humor, but also judgment and reason and linguistic virtuosity. And I think that for Shakespeare, wit was like a life without wit. It's not a witless life is not worth living. And that wit also has to do with not taking yourself seriously. Wit has to do with timing, with the art of conversation, with being able to listen attentively and find how to enter and exit a conversation in a way that works for everyone. So I think there's a very strong sense there. I think judgment phronesis or judgment, practical reason. This is also a very important intellectual virtue that's also kind of shades into some of the moral virtues, or is one of the four cardinal virtues, and kind of without it, the courage isn't very helpful if you don't have judgment.
I think this is what's really interesting, the idea of the moral virtues in isolation as being, they're sort of limited unless they're embedded within the intellectual and the practical virtues.
Yes.
And you see this a lot with people who are very moral people, but if they lack a sense of humour or they lack good judgment and so on, their morality sort of isn't much help.
Right, and courage without judgment,
exactly,
it gets
crucial.
Young people in trouble, it gets armies in trouble, so we need the intellectual virtues to make useful and to allow the moral virtues to flourish. And so, education's a good place for that to happen.
And of course,
try to do both of those kinds of trainings.
And we're having this conversation at a great university.
Yes.
And I get asked a lot, what's the point of higher ed? Why, especially when you have a freshman, why am I in college? And there's a lot of answers to that question that you can give. There's anxiety about job prospects. You need a certain kind of practical training. But if you really took a step back and you thought about why would you create such an institution as this, it is actually the most romantic and idealistic manifestation of what it means to develop and nurture the intellectual virtues, a sense of intellectual hospitality, a sense of the scholarly virtues, and what that could mean for an individual and for society. Because you don't build a great campus such as this and invite the smartest people in the world who are passionate merely about understanding their various disciplines, whether it's art history or neurobiology, and give them the freedom to explore and then get the most promising students here, unless you fundamentally believe that there is value to exploring the question of whether some things can be believed because they're grounded in better reasons. The entire enterprise of a university or college is premised on the assumption that some reasons are better than others. And we can disagree and we can argue about them, but it's not just anarchic. And so we try to nurture in people a little bit more of an appreciation of evidence-based reasoning. Mm-hmm. We push them on what are your reasons for believing this or that. Is the structure of your argument clear enough? Have you anticipated all different points of view? And I think that what we're trying to develop in people is a sense of the value of trying to know things rather than have any old damn opinion that you might choose to have. And it is the long-term benefit for an individual human being and for society that I think is the great contribution of colleges and universities to the well-being of humankind. And so when sometimes we wonder what is the point of it all, I really do think that fundamentally the point of it all is to create a community of trust where what really binds us together is our predetermined commitment to engage each other in rational conversation, and when there's disagreement, to deepen the conversation rather than suspend it. Nobody figured out whether light was a particle or a wave by shouting down their opponents, right? A little more evidence, a little more argumentation, and that's a model for the students who see that as an exemplar of how to live a life, and also a model, I think, for how free and diverse societies maintain their freedom and their diversity.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I think that's a great note on which to end. So thank you very much to my panelists for this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.